Aaron King didn't come to the mountains to hide from anyone. He came because the noise of people no longer made sense. After nearly 3 decades of building furniture for upscale showrooms that treated craftsmanship like a seasonal color trend, Aaron sold his name, his tools, and his stake in a small but lucrative business. Then he vanished from every catalog and email list he had once fought to be in. He bought land in the southern edge of the Bitterroot Range, a place where maps stopped pretending to know every corner, where the wind had space to argue with the trees, and where his hands could finally move in silence. The land wasn't vast, but it was honest. A cabin sat tucked between the ridge and a shallow river that carved its way through pine and birch. The trail that cut across the lower slope had been there long before Aaron, used by hunters in the fall, kids in the summer, and hikers who knew better than to leave trash behind. It wasn't a legal easement, but it was known, understood. It was one of those quiet agreements that existed before fences and lawyers. And Aaron, despite the solitude he often claimed to want, never once thought to block that trail. He used it, too, daily, in fact, because it led directly to the river, where he fished and walked and sometimes just sat, watching shadows lean across the water as the day aged. He didn't decorate his cabin, not in the way magazines would. There were no rugs from obscure villages or reclaimed wood walls painted to look old. Everything inside had a function, some made by him, some carried in, and all of it arranged with the kind of calm practicality that only comes from years of seeing things fall apart if they're not built right. Aaron's life was quiet but never empty. He made bows in the winter, repaired fences for neighbors in the spring, fished in the summer, and carved spoons and bowls from wind-fallen wood when the weather forced him indoors. He had no wife, no children, and no real interest in explaining himself to people who found that unusual. Then came Karen Henderson. She arrived in late spring, just after the thaw, when the road stopped cracking under your tires and the air smelled like wet bark. The first time Aaron saw her, she was standing beside a black SUV with Montana plates and fresh dealership tags, directing movers who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. The house she moved into wasn't new. Built in the late 80s, it sat just a few hundred yards up the trail from Aaron's, on a plot that had changed hands 3 times in the last decade. Most buyers treated it like a seasonal escape. Come in July, leave in September, and never once fix the broken gutter that clanged against the siding when the wind picked up. Karen, however, had come to stay. She introduced herself a few days later, uninvited, knocking on Aaron's door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a basket that tried too hard to be quaint. Banana bread, store-bought, and wrapped in plastic. Aaron accepted it politely, listened as she explained that she had moved up from Spokane to finally breathe clean air, and that she was invested in the well-being of the entire area. She mentioned plans for the house, renovations, a possible guest, cabin, and maybe, in time, a trailhead coffee stand. Aaron nodded when appropriate, offered no encouragement, and sent her off with a polite warning about bears. The weeks that followed were filled with sounds the mountain didn't care for: generators, electric saws, and voices that didn't understand how echoes worked in open space. Karen brought in contractors, then fired them. She started digging for a septic upgrade, then argued with the county when permits delayed her timeline. She called the sheriff when she found bullet casings near the edge of her lot. Never mind they were old and from deer season. She asked Aaron more than once whether he got a lot of strangers walking through the woods. Aaron told her plainly that the trail was used by locals and had been for generations, that it ran across public access through the southern edge of her property for about 20 yards before returning to county-managed forest land, that no one had ever fenced it, blocked it, or claimed it. Karen responded with a pause, then a smile, then silence. That was her pattern. She never argued outright. She simply took in information and later reshaped it into whatever version suited her plan. Aaron wasn't worried at first. People bluster. People get territorial, especially when they feel out of control. But in early June, just before sunrise on a Sunday morning, he took his usual walk toward the river and stopped dead in his tracks. Where the trail crossed behind Karen's property, there now stood a fresh metal gate. Welded, not screwed, locked with a thick chain and a combination padlock that still had its barcode sticker clinging to the side. Beside the gate was a sign. Private property. No trespassing. Below that, smaller text. Trespassers will be reported and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Aaron stared at it for a long time. The air was quiet except for the birds and the creek. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was measuring something, how much of this was ignorance, how much was fear, and how much was just arrogance wrapped in legal language. The gate didn't just block the trail, it insulted the place. It told the land that the people here were no longer welcome to treat it with quiet respect. It rewrote history with a sign and a chain. He turned around and walked back, slower than usual, and didn't tell anyone. Not yet. He needed to be sure this wasn't a misunderstanding. The next day, he tried to speak to Karen directly. No answer at her door, though he could hear music inside, classical, overly loud, and mismatched to the hour. He left a note in her mailbox. "Hi, Karen. Saw the new gate. Let's talk before this becomes something it doesn't need to be. Aaron." The note disappeared, but there was no reply. 2 days later, he received a letter from a private property management firm in Helena, stating that Henderson Holdings, LLC, had formally restricted access to all non-invitees on the parcel. It was typed, cold, and mailed overnight. Aaron folded it and placed it in his drawer beside the fishhooks and his father's knife. He didn't call anyone, didn't rant. He simply waited, because some lines, once crossed, demand an answer, and some gates, once locked, demand to be moved, not argued, not debated, not tiptoed around. Moved. He just hadn't decided how loud that movement needed to be. Yet, 3 mornings after the gate had gone up, Aaron returned to the trail at dawn, not with confrontation in mind, but to confirm what he already knew. The padlock was new, its chrome casing glinting in the light, untouched by rain or rust. The posts had been set deep, likely with concrete, and were perfectly aligned. Whoever installed them had done so with precision and permanence in mind. It wasn't a temporary deterrent. It was a statement. He crouched, running his hand along the base, noting the faint scent of curing sealant. This hadn't been done in a rush. It had been planned, calculated. Aaron rose, looked toward the upper edge of the property where Karen's house sat, mostly hidden by a fringe of trees, and wondered if she was awake, watching. He didn't linger. Instead, he cut eastward through the brush and down a narrow deer path that paralleled the river. The route was uneven, cluttered with fallen branches and patches of soft mud. It was navigable but tedious, and it confirmed something he'd already sensed. Without the main trail, access to the river would become increasingly difficult for anyone who wasn't young, spry, or equipped with time and patience. It wasn't about convenience. It was about control. When he returned to his cabin, Aaron didn't drink coffee or sit with his usual slow deliberation. He pulled the lease folder from his cabinet, laid out the papers, and reread every line of the agreement he'd signed with the county when he acquired the land. Clause 4.2 clearly stated that the access trail bordering parcel number 16A, which belonged now to Karen Henderson, must remain open to foot traffic, per existing local precedent and oral historical use. The language was oddly poetic for a government document, and yet it had been enough to allow multiple generations to use the trail without challenge. Until now. Still, Aaron didn't call the county. He knew how these things worked. Delay, deferral, and bureaucracy piled on top of politeness until months passed and nothing changed. Instead, he returned to the trail the next morning with bolt cutters. He didn't hide them. He carried them slung over his shoulder like a farmer might carry a shovel. When he reached the gate, he gave one last look at the forest line, took the cutters in both hands, and applied steady pressure. With a sharp crack, the chain snapped. He removed the padlock, coiled the broken links, and hung them on the post with deliberate neatness. He then pushed the gate open, just wide enough to walk through, and continued down the trail to the river like he always had. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt resolved. That night, as he sat outside whittling a fresh handle for a skinning knife, he heard the sound of a vehicle pulling into his drive. The engine didn't idle like a visitor's. It shut off with sharp intent. He stood slowly, set the knife down, and waited as Karen stepped out of her SUV, clutching a folder in one hand and a cell phone in the other. Her clothes were clean, city casual, jeans that had never touched dirt and a fleece vest zipped to the chin. She looked composed, but there was tension in the way she walked. "You cut the chain," she said without preamble. "I did," Aaron replied. "That's destruction of private property." Aaron crossed his arms, not defensively, but to signal that he wasn't going to fidget under her gaze. "The trail's not private. My lease says it remains open. You blocked it." "I unblocked it." Karen held out the folder. "This is a land survey, updated 2 months ago. It shows the trail running through my property. I have every right to restrict access." He didn't take the folder. "You can restrict what's yours, but not what's protected by county agreement. That trail's been there longer than either of us. I have the papers too." "You can't just do whatever you want because you've been here longer," she snapped, her voice tightening. "There are rules, processes. You can't act like a vigilante in the woods and expect no consequences." Aaron's expression didn't change. "Then report it. Let the county sort it." "I already have," Karen said, tapping her phone. "They're reviewing it now. And until they issue a ruling, I'd advise you not to touch that gate again. If you do, I'll involve the sheriff." He nodded once. "All right." Karen turned to leave, then stopped. "You know, I moved here because I believed this place had integrity, that people respected boundaries." Aaron didn't reply. She got into her SUV and left without another word. The next day, Aaron received a certified letter from the county land office stating that a complaint had been lodged regarding boundary disputes and unauthorized access. He was advised not to interfere with disputed fixtures until the matter could be reviewed. No timeline was given, no clear direction, just the kind of procedural fog that let disputes simmer until someone gave up or got exhausted. He did not go back to the gate, not that day. Instead, he spent the afternoon sharpening tools and repairing the railing on his porch, keeping his hands busy while his mind wrestled with the growing awareness that this wasn't going to end with a conversation or a signature. 3 days later, while walking back from the eastern trailhead, Aaron found something strange at the edge of his property. Fresh tire tracks where no one should have driven, leading into the tree line and disappearing over soft soil. Curious, he followed them. They led to a clearing he'd used occasionally for chopping firewood. There, parked in the middle of the space, was Karen's vehicle. Not a mistake, not a detour. It was deliberate. The doors were locked. The wheels turned slightly as if she'd driven in and parked with care. Aaron stood in the clearing for a long time, wondering why she'd leave her vehicle here. Was it meant as provocation? A dare? Or worse, an unspoken claim, like she was trying to redefine the land through presence rather than argument? He walked back to his cabin in silence, retrieved a length of steel chain he'd used to anchor his canoe during flood season, looped it through the undercarriage of her vehicle, and locked it to the trunk of an old fir that had stood longer than the state lines around it. Then he wrote a note on the back of a receipt, folded it, and placed it under the windshield wiper. "You blocked the trail. I blocked your road. Consider us even. A." That night, it rained. By morning, the note was soaked and barely legible, but still there. The car remained where it was. No one came. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that Karen returned, this time on foot, her expression unreadable as she stared at the chain. She didn't scream, didn't call, She simply stared at it, then at the tree, then back at the note. Aaron watched from the porch, not hiding but not announcing himself either. He expected an outburst. Instead, she turned and walked back into the woods. The car stayed for another day and a half before it was gone, chain and all. He never saw her remove it. But the next week, the gate was rebuilt. Stronger, taller, electrified. And that's when Aaron knew. This wasn't about land anymore. It was about war. The newly rebuilt gate wasn't just a physical barrier. It was an act of psychological warfare. Karen hadn't simply replaced what Aaron had dismantled. She had upgraded it. This time, the metal posts were reinforced with concrete poured into the soil and carefully camouflaged with river stones to appear natural. A thick industrial chain wove through welded eyelets, and a heavy-duty keypad lock blinked red when he approached almost mockingly. But the detail that stopped Aaron cold was the wiring. Thin black cables running from the base of the left post up to a narrow box mounted just behind the steel frame. It wasn't large, but he recognized the components. Motion detection, perhaps even low-voltage current. The entire setup hummed faintly, not loud enough for the average passerby to notice, but just enough to confirm his suspicion. She had electrified the gate. Aaron stood 5 feet from the obstruction, arms crossed, staring in silence for nearly 15 minutes. He wasn't trying to solve it, not yet. He was trying to absorb what it meant. Karen had crossed from territorial into something more clinical, something obsessed. It wasn't about keeping people out, it was about punishing intrusion. And more troubling than the wires or the new lock or the bolts sunk 2 feet deep was the fact that someone had helped her build this. This wasn't a DIY hardware store job. This was installed by professionals. Maybe a contractor, maybe someone in security. And that meant she was putting money behind her cause. Not effort, not frustration. Money. That changed the equation. It always did. He didn't touch the gate. Not that day, and not the next. Instead, he spent 2 days tracing the trail in both directions, documenting every junction, every runoff, and every unofficial detour used by locals to skirt the blocked access. He met with 2 neighbors during these walks, Harold, a retired surveyor who had owned land near the northern bluff for 40 years, and Laney, a seasonal hiker and freelance cartographer who lived part-time on the East Ridge. Both expressed concern. Harold mentioned that his great-niece had recently been turned around by a woman near the new gate who warned her that trespassers would be detained. Laney had seen posted flyers by Karen's mailbox offering guided trail access for guests only, with QR codes linked to a reservation system. A reservation system for land that wasn't even wholly private. Aaron gathered these anecdotes without reacting. He wasn't building a case, not in the formal sense, but he was building something. Momentum, perhaps, or clarity. By the 3rd day, he took his lease agreement, 3 annotated trail maps, a flash drive with geotagged photos, and copies of handwritten testimonies, and drove to the county land office. The building sat in the middle of a dusty lot beside a defunct diner, its lobby filled with stale coffee air and the sound of worn carpet under anxious feet. Aaron waited 40 minutes to speak with a clerk who glanced at his documents with the pained smile of someone who had seen too many angry men holding folders. But when he calmly explained the electrified gate, the motion sensors, and the growing list of residents being turned away from public access, the clerk's demeanor shifted. She took the folder, promised a review, entered a notation, and as Aaron walked out of the office into the sharp bite of afternoon sun, he didn't feel victorious. He felt something worse, like the starter pistol had finally gone off. That weekend, the first real act of retaliation arrived not in person, but by mail. A letter, postmarked from Helena, arrived in a plain, white envelope. Inside were 2 documents, a cease and desist order and a civil trespass warning issued through Karen's legal representation. The language was polished but aggressive, claiming multiple deliberate entries onto private property, including unlawful observation, destruction of property, and intimidation. The letter referenced witness accounts and security footage that Aaron had no knowledge of and claimed damages in excess of $5,000, pending escalation. It was postured just shy of a full lawsuit but worded clearly enough: back off or we escalate. Aaron set the documents on his workbench, poured himself a cup of bitter black coffee, and leaned over the sink as he drank, watching the rain gather at the edge of the porch. It wasn't the threat of legal action that unsettled him. It was the fiction of it, the rewriting of events to paint him as the aggressor. He hadn't stepped foot on her land since the note on the windshield. He hadn't touched the gate. He hadn't blocked another vehicle. Yet here it was, an attempt to flip the narrative, to make him the invader. He called no one. No lawyer, no official. Instead, he installed a trail camera facing the lower branch of the old switchback trail, aimed toward the stretch near his own boundary. He didn't need it for evidence. He needed it for peace of mind. If she was watching him, he would at least know when and how. He then spent 2 days reinforcing the side trail with cleared brush, flagged markers, and gravel to allow others to reach the river without using the main path. He knew it wasn't a solution, it was a workaround. But sometimes small adjustments held a problem at bay long enough to think clearly. And then came the fire. It happened on a Tuesday morning, just before sunrise, while Aaron was walking the eastern route. He smelled it before he saw it. A thick, acrid curl of smoke rising just beyond the slope behind his cabin. He ran, boots thudding against pine roots and wet leaves, heart pounding not from panic but a sense of inevitability. It was his woodshed. Or what was left of it. Flames were still curling from the back edge of the structure, licking at the stacked timber like kindling. He shouted once, then grabbed the nearby drum of rainwater and began dousing the edge with a rusted bucket, over and over until the smoke outpaced the fire and the crackling turned to hissing steam. The damage wasn't total, but it was targeted. The fire hadn't spread, it hadn't been wild. It had been set with intention and allowed to bloom just enough to make a point. The sheriff came hours later, slow-moving and weathered, clipboard in hand, asking questions without any real belief in answers. Aaron gave the facts. No accelerants found, no witnesses, no camera near the shed. Just a small, controlled fire that might have been started by a stray ember, though there was no campfire nearby. The report was filed. A warning was issued. And that was that. That night, Aaron sat at his table long after dark, carving the half-charred edge of a ruined beam into a sharp wedge. Not as a weapon, not as a symbol, just to give his hand something to do that wasn't clenching. And in the quiet, he made a decision. Not to fight her. Not yet, but to change something fundamental. She wanted power, visibility, fear. He would give her none of those things. He would build a case. Quietly, legally, meticulously, and he would do it the only way that worked in places like this. By outlasting her. The real shift came not with fire or documents, but with silence. The kind that settles in after a confrontation and refuses to move. After the woodshed incident, there were no more letters, no more shouted warnings across the trail, and no more visits from Karen. But the gate remained, fortified and inert, like a tombstone planted in the middle of a forest path. Aaron didn't try to remove it again. He worked around it, quietly maintaining the alternate trail, reinforcing side access with signage and hand-built steps carved into the slope. He spoke less to neighbors now, not from paranoia, but from focus. Every action he took had a purpose. He began documenting everything: photos with timestamps, dates of access interruptions, a log of trail users who'd been turned back or confronted. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was preparing. Then, without announcement, a truck arrived one morning at the trail's edge. Aaron watched from the tree line as two men in uniform unloaded survey equipment. They didn't wear badges, but they moved with practiced efficiency. tripods, GPS markers, long tape reels, and a tablet mounted on a clipboard. He waited 15 minutes before approaching, boots deliberate against the earth, voice calm when he asked who had sent them. The younger of the two flinched but answered professionally. Private contract, hired by the landowner on parcel 16A for documentation of boundaries. Aaron didn't argue. He asked if they had county approval. The older one shrugged, said it wasn't needed for a private survey unless it involved municipal land. Aaron nodded once, stepped back, and took his own photos. The equipment, the truck, their position relative to the disputed gate, not as a threat. As insurance. The surveyors finished by midday and left without further incident, but the message was clear. Karen wasn't done. She was recalibrating. Not through court, not through county. She was preparing her version of the truth to submit later, and Aaron knew how that played out. You don't fight the facts, you drown them in new ones. Sure enough, 2 days later, flyers appeared on trail signs and telephone poles around the edge of the community, polished, laminated, printed in full color. They bore Karen's name and the logo of her holding company and announced a new vision for trail sustainability. Beneath that, a list of proposed changes: preservation of local paths through permit-based access, monitored entry points, and usage, logs to prevent erosion, trespass, and vandalism. It sounded official, protective, even noble. But Aaron knew what it was, an attempt to claim moral ground through administrative theater. He drove to the county office again. This time, he met with a compliance officer, young, polite, and clearly overwhelmed by the piles of similar rural complaints on his desk. But Aaron came prepared. He laid out the flyers, the survey activity, the digital logs, the cease and desist letter, and most importantly, a notarized copy of the original easement clause from his lease agreement. The officer reviewed them carefully, occasionally frowning, occasionally nodding, and finally promised to initiate an administrative inquiry. It wasn't an investigation. It wasn't even enforcement. But it was movement, and in these parts, that counted for something. A week passed. Rain came, heavy and persistent, flooding the lower edge of the alternate trail. The main gate still held, dry and untouched. Aaron didn't touch it. He repaired the alternate trail again, this time adding a raised footbridge made of split logs and thick rope. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Word spread among locals that his trail remained open despite everything, and gradually, hikers began returning. They didn't linger. They didn't ask questions. But they came, and that was enough. Then, late one afternoon, he spotted movement near the river's edge. A woman with binoculars, not Karen, someone younger, thinner, dressed in hiking gear too clean to be real. She was photographing the riverbank. Aaron approached slowly, asking if she needed help. She introduced herself as a researcher collecting data for a regional environmental impact report. He asked which institution she worked for. She hesitated, then claimed it was a freelance project for a sustainability nonprofit based in Missoula. She didn't offer a card. He didn't push. But that night, he checked the nonprofit's registry. No such organization existed under the name she gave. A day later, a local paper ran a small column about increased interest in ecotourism expansion in the Bitterroot region. It quoted an unnamed community development partner, describing the forest trails as underutilized, unsafe, and in need of modern access controls. It didn't mention Karen. It didn't need to. Aaron recognized the phrasing. It was almost identical to the flyer she'd posted. This wasn't just about fences anymore. It was optics, reframing, a chess game played through public sentiment, policy jargon, and soft threats dressed as reforms. Aaron knew he had to shift again. So he went to the one place he hadn't yet involved, state lands management. Not to escalate, but to register his own map of the trail system, marked with traditional routes, historical usage points, and GPS coordinates. He submitted it with a formal request to register the path as a community easement under grandfathered access, citing over 50 years of uninterrupted use. It was a long process. It required verification, but once accepted, it would permanently block any future attempt to privatize the route. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet, not even the neighbors. He wanted no rumors, no premature declarations. The application would take weeks, but it was moving. And for the first time in months, as Aaron sat on the edge of the river that evening, watching the last light fall between the trees and listening to the water thread through stone, he felt something different than anger or strategy. He felt patient. And in a fight like this, patience was power. The peace didn't last. It never does. Not when one side measures silence as weakness and the other mistakes resilience for withdrawal. It had been nearly a month since Aaron filed his petition for trail protection, and though the process moved slower than cold sap in winter, it was moving. There had been quiet acknowledgement from the state office, a phone call verifying GPS points, a follow-up requesting affidavits from longtime trail users, and a promise that the request would be reviewed in the next quarterly assessment. Aaron was content to wait. He wasn't rushing toward victory. He was building something more durable than winning, a precedent, a boundary backed not by chains or wires but by law. He knew how the mountains worked. Nothing changed quickly, but once it did, the shape of the land rarely forgot. That understanding, however, was not shared by Karen. What followed next was not theatrical, not overt, but deliberate in its erosion of everyday comfort. It began with the power. On a Monday morning, Aaron woke to find that every outlet in his workshop had gone dead. The lights flickered and failed, and the air compressor sputtered mid-cycle, leaving a strange pressure in the air like something unfinished. At first, he assumed a blown fuse, perhaps damage from the recent storm, but the breakers were fine. The cabin's core systems, refrigerator, lighting, water heater, were intact. Only the line running to the workshop was compromised. Outside, he traced the buried cable to where it branched at a steel junction box nestled behind the woodshed. The lock on the box had been tampered with, not broken, but scratched and forced. When he pried it open, he found the conduit inside severed, not cut with a blade, but crushed inward, as if someone had clamped it with bolt cutters and twisted until the copper folded and cracked. No note, no sign, just silence and damage. He made temporary repairs using salvage parts from an old generator, but the disruption was not just physical. It was a message, masked as coincidence, calibrated to raise suspicion without enough evidence to accuse. 3 days later, his internet went down. Not abruptly, but intermittently, growing slower each day until even emails wouldn't send. The satellite receiver on the roof was misaligned. He adjusted it twice, climbing onto the damp shingles in the rain with a wrench and a towel, before realizing the base plate had been loosened, its bolts unscrewed by hand and tucked neatly beneath the satellite. Whoever had done it hadn't wanted to break anything. They wanted to interfere, to inconvenience, to unsettle. And it worked. Aaron found himself pausing before locking his doors, double-checking trail cameras, testing lights twice. Not because he was scared, but because he was angry. And anger makes a man careful. Then came the animal traps. At first, he thought them remnants from a careless hunter. Steel snares with rusted jaws laid along the upper ridge near the trail's overgrown fork. But upon closer inspection, they were new, recently purchased, clean and greased, with bait residue still fresh. Worse, they weren't placed along animal paths. They were positioned near foot travel, partially concealed beneath leaves. One was within a yard of a bench he'd carved years ago for hikers to rest by the overlook. It didn't spring on a creature. It snapped on a boot, a volunteer trail repairer who screamed loud enough to bring Aaron running. No bones were broken, but the injury was real. A report was filed. Sheriff deputies arrived, slow and skeptical. They documented. They measured. They asked questions with neutral faces. But nothing was confirmed. Nothing tied directly to Karen or to anyone. It was rural land. Anyone could have set them, they said. Anyone at all. Aaron didn't argue. He simply filed his own formal complaint against unknown parties and spent the next morning removing every hidden threat he could find, collecting them in a metal bin that he locked in the tool shed as evidence. But he knew what was coming next. The escalation wasn't spontaneous. It followed a logic. First disrupt comfort, then destabilize trust, then break something irreplaceable. And so, it wasn't shocking when the gate disappeared. It happened overnight. One evening it was there, tall, wired, locked, a monument to Karen's stubborn hold. By morning it was gone. Not destroyed. Removed. The posts had been pulled, the wiring clipped, the keypad unscrewed. No debris left behind. Only the impression in the soil and a few scattered bolts half buried in pine needles. Aaron didn't celebrate. This wasn't a victory. It was a setup. Sure enough, less than 48 hours later, he received a visit from the sheriff's office. Two men, younger than he expected, polite but firm. They informed him that Karen had filed a theft and vandalism report. The gate, she claimed, was dismantled and stolen from her property sometime between dusk on Thursday and dawn on Friday. Valued at over $6,000. Surveillance footage, she said, had been lost due to a technical failure, but she believed Aaron was responsible, based on ongoing hostility and prior threats. Aaron didn't yell. He didn't argue. He provided his timeline, offered to share his trail camera footage, and invited them to inspect the area themselves. The officers did so. They left without making any accusations, but with the tone of men who now had more paperwork than answers. The next day, 3 men arrived in a utility truck bearing the name of a private security firm. They spent hours reinstalling a new gate. This one wasn't just stronger. It was embedded in a prefab concrete footing with embedded plate steel supports and a reinforced locking system that resembled something from a government facility. There were no visible wires this time, but there were small sensor boxes on either side, blinking green every 10 seconds. Aaron didn't approach. He didn't speak to the workers. But he took photos. And later, when the workers left, he noticed something odd. A new sign, professionally printed, mounted beside the gate. Access subject to surveillance. Data retained per private property regulations. Private property regulations. The phrase stuck in his head like a splinter. It wasn't law. It wasn't even enforceable. But it sounded legal. It sounded official. And that was the point. By the end of the week, a letter arrived from a third-party legal consultant based in Boise, citing continued boundary violations, unauthorized trail restoration efforts, and obstruction of client security infrastructure. It threatened legal damages, sought injunctive relief, and listed a deadline. Cease all access within 7 days or face civil action. Aaron handed the letter to a new lawyer, someone he'd finally agreed to hire, not because he felt outmatched, but because it was time to stop doing this alone. The lawyer, a local woman with a reputation for unraveling bad paperwork, read the letter and raised an eyebrow. "She's trying to preempt your state filing," she said, flipping through his copies. "If she gets a private injunction first, it could delay your easement by months. That's her strategy. Drag you into civil court while your petition dies in red tape." Aaron said nothing. He just nodded and stared out the window of her office, where the hills folded into each other like tired shoulders under a gray sky. That night, his bridge was destroyed. The raised footbridge he'd built over the marshy flood runoff, timbers split, rope cut, support beams removed and tossed into the water. It wasn't fire. It wasn't an animal. It was methodical. And this time, there were boot prints. He took photos. Filed another report, and when the sheriff came, it wasn't the same deputy. It was the older one, the quiet one. He listened, inspected, took notes, and just before he left, he muttered, "She's pushing. Harder than I've seen anyone around here push. Whatever she wants, she's not going to stop. You sure you want to stay in this fight?" Aaron didn't respond immediately. He looked toward the trees, where the broken bridge hung in pieces like ribs torn from a carcass. And then he said, "She's betting I'll wear out first." And that was it. Not bravado, not vengeance, just endurance. And the quiet realization that escalation hadn't peaked yet. It was still climbing. Aaron had always understood the difference between persistence and obsession. Persistence keeps your boots moving, keeps your tools sharp, keeps your posture straight when your back's sore and the wind stings your face. Obsession makes you forget where you were going in the first place. It changes your goals. It sharpens everything into a single point until you're no longer protecting what's yours, but reacting to what's theirs. He had fought for the trail, for his right to walk through land he'd respected for years, not because he needed to win, but because he refused to be erased. And now, as he stood beneath the canopy of trees at the far edge of his property, watching headlights bounce through the forest in the dark like predators circling a campfire, he felt something shift. This wasn't about a path anymore. It was about territory, claimed not with fences or documents, but with exhaustion, pressure, and time. Earlier that week, a hearing date had been set for the injunction Karen's legal team filed. Aaron's attorney, Sarah Lockwood, had called that morning with clipped urgency. Karen had accelerated the process, petitioned the court under emergency access restrictions, citing safety threats and uncontrolled trespasser behavior from Aaron and his known associates. There was no mention of the broken bridge, the fire, the traps, the severed cable. None of the documented incidents had made it into her version of the truth. Just words printed with enough legal vocabulary to sound neutral, enough footnotes to suggest objectivity, and enough passive voice to erase everything she had done. Sarah wasn't shaken, but she was blunt. "She's trying to lock this down before the state grants your easement. If she gets this order in place, she can stall it, maybe indefinitely." Aaron had prepared for a long fight, but this was something new. This was a shortcut through the process. A way to take power by turning fatigue into advantage. That night, he sat at his workbench with every document laid out. Maps, photos, affidavits, the easement clause, his notes, every timestamp, every statement, every dated image. He'd kept them meticulously, not because he expected a courtroom, but because he knew truth had to be shown, not told. He thought about the judge who would read these papers. Someone who might never walk a forest trail, someone who might not care that hikers had used this path before there were cameras in the woods or smart locks on gates. The documents wouldn't speak for him. They'd only survive on their own strength. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, his decision was clear. The hearing was scheduled for Friday. But on Wednesday, Aaron made a move no one expected. He filed his own petition, not just in response to the injunction, but to challenge Karen's standing altogether. With Sarah's help, he pulled property tax records, usage permits, and business license filings. Buried in the paperwork was a detail Karen likely never imagined anyone would care about. Her holding company's official business designation did not include private security installation or land lease monetization. She had filed for a scenic retreat license, not a private land trust, which meant all of her surveillance infrastructure, all of her restricted signage, and even the gate itself were arguably outside the scope of what her business type allowed. It was thin, but it was pressure, and it worked. When Friday arrived, Karen didn't show up to court in person. Her legal team did. 3 attorneys dressed for corporate boardrooms, faces unreadable but not invincible. Sarah presented their defense with surgical precision, trailing legal definitions, historic usage precedent, state land connectivity, and an affidavit from a retired ranger who'd used the trail for over 40 years and called it a public fixture in everything but name. She also introduced the discrepancy in Karen's filings, casting doubt on the legality of her entire approach. It wasn't a knockout blow, but it was a fracture, and in legal rooms, fractures spread fast. By the end of the session, the judge issued a temporary stay on Karen's injunction, ordered an on-site inspection within 10 days, and declined to block Aaron's access in the meantime. It wasn't over. It wasn't final. But it was enough. Aaron didn't celebrate. He returned to his cabin with the same quiet step he'd used for years, walked past the broken beams of his bridge, past the sign Karen had reinstalled, past the trail that had become a scar instead of a path. But that evening, something unexpected happened. As the sun fell, casting the trees into long shadows and copper light, he heard footsteps on the slope. He turned, expecting Karen, or worse, someone from her team. Instead, it was a boy. Maybe 15, carrying a fishing rod, nervous but determined. "Sir," he said, "is it true we can walk through here again?" "My dad said the sign's fake." Aaron nodded once. "It is." The boy smiled, dipped his head, and walked on, disappearing into the trees without another word. That night, for the first time in months, Aaron left the gate open. Not physically, but symbolically. He lit the lantern on his porch. He didn't lock the shed. He sat beneath the stars and whittled a spoon from birchwood, hands steady, breath slow. And though he knew the war wasn't finished, he'd won something else that night. The right to breathe, to walk, to not be chased off the land by someone who'd never really listened to it. And in the hush of that forest, under the vast black sky, that was enough. The days that followed were quieter, but it was not the stillness of resolution. It was the breathing space that comes after the immediate danger has passed, when your muscles are still coiled out of habit and your mind keeps scanning for problems. Even when none appear, Aaron didn't relax, not entirely. He continued logging trail use, updating his file with quiet discipline, not because he feared Karen's return to aggression, but because he'd learned the rhythm of her tactics. Disappear, recalculate, then strike from a new angle. But something had changed that week, something subtle and foundational. The land around him, which had felt like it was closing in, slowly opened again. Foot traffic returned, light and infrequent but steady. 2 hikers here, a bow hunter there, a couple from the North Road who asked politely if they were allowed to pass and nearly cried from relief when Aaron nodded. They didn't talk long. No one did. The people who used the trail knew it wasn't something you explained to outsiders. You respected it by walking gently and leaving it as you found it. Karen remained physically absent for some time, retreating behind emails from lawyers and official filings. Her business permit came under scrutiny after Sarah forwarded their petition to the state's regulatory bureau, and by late summer, an inspector arrived quietly to review the property. Aaron didn't watch, but he heard. The inspector stayed almost 5 hours, requested multiple documents, and walked the perimeter himself. A week later, construction on a planned guest cabin at Karen's site was halted indefinitely pending permit clarifications. The laminated flyers were removed from every public post. The gate remained, but the electronics were gone. It now hung dormant, a husk of its former menace, its padlock untouched and symbolic more than functional. In time, it would rust. There was no grand confrontation, no courtroom finale, no single declaration that closed the book. Karen never apologized, never admitted to anything directly, and Aaron never expected her to. What came instead was absence. The lawsuits stopped. The letters stopped. The efforts to control the trail, to frame it in new terms, to privatize its soul, they faded under scrutiny and quiet resistance. And as fall came, painting the mountains in gold and ash, Aaron found himself no longer reacting. He was building again, slowly replacing the bridge with new timbers, this time higher and wider, using help from 2 neighbors who brought nails, coffee, and no questions. When they finished, they left behind a wooden sign carved from a salvaged beam. Use kindly. Pass through. Leave no trace. One afternoon in October, a letter arrived from the state office confirming that Aaron's petition had been reviewed, validated, and accepted. The trail was now formally registered as a community easement, open, protected, and recorded in county and state records. It was not dramatic, just a stamped certificate, plain and definitive. Aaron framed it, not for pride, but for clarity. It hung above the entry to his workshop, beside his father's old handsaw and a photograph of the river taken 20 years earlier when the trees were thinner, and he still thought silence was something you earned. That winter, the first snowfall arrived heavy and early. The trail remained visible under the weight, its footprints delicate and persistent. Aaron walked it each morning, boots breaking crusted snow, each step pressing the memory of a battle not won by rage or force but by stillness, law, and presence. Karen's house remained quiet. A for-lease sign appeared in her drive by January. No one took it. Spring came late. By then, the new bridge was seasoned, the trail worn smooth again.